Hello, everyone. I'm Ann Snitow, and like Ariane, who started this day off, I'm from the New School and eager to welcome you and say how overjoyed we are to have you here at the New School. Women's Learning Partnership is very important to us, and we not only welcome you, but we welcome you forever. Come whenever you want. We'd like to have you around. And we feel this about the organizations that so many of you represent. We're just thrilled to be hosting this. I should say that in the name of talking about the difficulties in the United States, that it took many years to get the Gender Studies program. I'm the Director of Gender Studies here at the New School, and it took many, many years for me to get this program going. We have a small minor with a zero budget at the New School for social research, so you can see that the La Luta continua all over the world in different registers. I was very excited. Where's Frances? Is she in the room? I was very excited that Frances went to the New School and had her first awakening as a modern woman and a sexual modern woman who had contraception, maybe just down the street at the Sanger Clinic, who knows. But this part of the city has been a hotbed of radicalism, but also we're in the middle of this terrible reaction. So we're sort of all joining hands. I feel this is true in the New School, just as it's true in so many other locations you all know, and that we're struggling together. The panel today is, this final panel is, where do we go from here? Aha. And our panelists are, first, Charlotte Bunch, founder and former director the Center for Women's Global Leadership at Rutgers University, and of course, one of the many people here today who are so instrumental in making UN Women. It's just a thrill to have all of you who worked on this. It's a historic moment to be grading you at this time and thanking you. The second speaker is Yakin Ertürk from Turkey. She's a professor of Middle East Technical University and a member of the European Committee on the Prevention of Torture. Our third speaker is Farah Karimi. She's from Iran and the Netherlands, and she's an executive director of Oxfam Novib. And our final speaker is Manaz Fahmy, and also Iran and the USA, but also the founder of Women's Learning Partnership, to which we all owe this very extraordinary day, and we thank her very much. So we'll start with Charlotte.
Hi, everybody. Great. Thank you. Thank you to Women's Learning Partnership and the New School for this wonderful day. I hope that where do we go from here? It's a huge subject. I hope that where we go from here is that everyone will continue these discussions, because the most important thing I'm here to say today is if you want UN Women to be the organization you want it to be, then you have to be proactive in trying to make it be that. Because I think, as June said at the very end, it's really important that we work toward our vision of UN Women, understanding that UN Women is the UN, and we are the NGO civil society community, and our job is both to push it, to hold it to be accountable, but also to try to provide ideas, visions, and possibilities for what UN Women can be. And in that regard, I was going to start just by saying that I think this whole day has been a wonderful, exciting moment for us, because in many ways the founding of UN Women was somewhat dampened by coming into being in the midst of the worst economic crisis of the last 50 years, particularly given that all of us feel that it needs at least a $1 billion budget to do the job it has to do. So I've decided today that instead of money, we have the people's power of the social democracy movements and the NGOs, and we are actually the energy, and this discussion today about social movements has really kind of re-energized me that maybe this was the right moment, even if it wasn't the right moment economically. It's the right moment in terms of our sense of possibility, remembering, as each of the social movements before, whether the 60s or the 89 movement or any other movement that you've been involved in anywhere in the world, that it's that belief that it can be different, that it can change, that is most important to the creation of UN Women. Because we didn't do this work, those of us who were involved in it, or you, for it just to be the same. Or even just the same with a little bit more money. We did it because we wanted to see a larger, more powerful vehicle for the visions and the voices of women's rights in the United Nations. And I think that really comes from the way in which NGOs and civil society lay claim to this. I want to start with just a couple of reflections from the panel before, because it's so important to my vision of UN Women. And I think one of the key roles that UN Women can play is to raise the profile and bring more to visibility the voices of women activists all over the world. The voices of women who are defending the human rights and the rights of women at the grassroots in every national struggle, whether the struggles that we just saw that Karima brought to us, the women who are present, because so often we don't hear about the women who are doing this work. And if UN Women could do only one thing, it would be to make sure, as Bachelet said to us when she challenged us about what were women's views on climate change, on the economic crisis, etc. Well, there are women working on and talking about these things all over the world. But are those voices heard here in New York at the UN? How do we make UN Women a vehicle for hearing those voices and also for defending them? Because those voices are under attack in almost all parts of the world. So I would say one of the first tasks of UN Women is to raise the voices, the profile of women around the world, of the solutions and ideas that are coming from women locally, globally, and nationally. And secondly, to defend those women who are themselves human rights defenders, and to link to the conversation before, are often under attack because they are exercising their most fundamental human right, which is the right to participate, to speak, to play a role in creating whatever your society or your nation is about. And that, to me, is a part of the claim of the universality of human rights, is the right of women to be heard. And I think it's very important when we get into the universality and diversity discussion to remember that as a women's movement, we have always been about trying to go beyond dichotomies. And I think one of the most destructive dichotomies for women's rights claims today is the dichotomy that has been set up between universality and diversity. We are about both. We are about the universal right of every woman, everywhere, whether that's marginalized voices like lesbians or marginalized voices like Roma women or marginalized voices of women in rural areas and grassroots communities without the internet. We are about the right of the universal right of all women to claim their rights and to have those same fundamental rights. But it doesn't mean that all those women's experiences or way of building or developing strategies will be the same. And that is where our diversity must come to play, because women everywhere will shape specific strategies, specific solutions, and have specific debates and arguments with each other, because there will never be and shouldn't be any one woman's position anywhere. And it is the right of women to engage in that that is the universal human rights claim. So I think we must be very clear that when they say women's rights are human rights, when we say women's rights are human rights, it's not just a rhetoric. It is about women's claim to be present in all of these debates, and it must be core to the defense of women in the UN work on UN Women. And the claim to human rights is not just rhetoric, so I hope that the next time we get to talk to Undersecretary General Bachelet, we can talk about why her statement about going beyond human rights, I don't think it's going beyond. I think it's making specific what the human rights claims really mean in building the case for stronger support of women. So I hope that we will keep that human rights frame very clear in the work of UN Women. Which then brings me to the challenge I want to leave with all of us for the way forward, which is we have outlined as the part of the GEAR campaign, and many of you have seen it, 6 points around civil society participation. You can go to the GEAR website, www.gearcampaign.org, or pick up our literature to see the 6 points. They're pretty obvious things like thematic advisors and advisory committees and so forth. What I think is the challenge for us is when we get at those tables, what are we going to say? When we get at those tables, do we have clarity about how we want to use and make the most strategic advantage of now having UN Women? Not are we going to wait for UN Women to solve all the problems of women, but how do we want to use the presence now of an Undersecretary General who has the ear of the Secretary General of the UN? How are we going to use the upgraded presence at the country level of UN Women having a mandate to be a part of planning of the UN's programs at the country level? How are we going to use this strengthened voice to make a strategic leap forward on the issues that we care about? So my challenge to you is, what do we see as the strategic advantage of UN Women? How do we think it can be a greater force within the UN for women's rights? Not just that we want it to do everything, but what are the places? We worked for a long time to get violence on the human rights agenda. What's the next step? The UN can't solve violence against women. We saw it's on the 5 thematic areas. We know it's always on people's minds. What's the next step? What do we want UN Women to help us do in the struggle around an issue like violence against women? What is the strategic point of entry that UN Women offers us? How do we use it to lift up voices that aren't being heard, to propel discussion? When I heard Bachelet talking about the social protection package, the social protection floor, my first question was, what's a social protection floor for women around violence against women? What would it mean to actually have that security and that protection? How could we link this to something that she's doing not only as UN Women, but in the ILO, with the WHO? How do we think bigger about where we want to make those connections? I think she also gave us a really important challenge in thinking about how we prepare ourselves for being at the tables that we want her to open the door to. How do we have the discussion on the global macroeconomic problems that many women are now looking at? How do we take this opportunity to say, these are the things we want to see UN Women bringing to those institutions? It's not, and I think it's really important, it's not a substitute. UN Women is not a substitute for the movement. It is a part of our strategy. It must be something that we don't wait to say, what will they do, but we start to present proposals. We asked, many of you contributed in December for proposals to present to UN Women for part of their first 100 days. But I have to say that we only got 22 from the whole world, and we have a pretty large mailing list. So this made me think that actually we need to do a lot of thinking, not just everything we're doing, but where can the UN make a difference? Where would you see a role for the UN? This is not an agency that's going to have projects in every country that are going to solve all the problems. But where would it intervene in your strategy planning for women's economic empowerment? Where could it intervene at every level, so that as we go forward with these demands for space, for being at the table, we are also going forward with a clear agenda of what we want at that table. And as a final voice for me, I would say that one of the first things I want to take to that table is the protection of the right of women everywhere to be in the discussion is, in fact, a human rights protection. And the women have to be there in all their diversity, but we as the women who are there also have to be prepared to bring very clear thinking, our own strategies, our own steps forward, and that's one of the tasks that I hope we'll engage in over the next year. Thank you.
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. As you notice, I left my notes there because everything I prepared for myself seemed totally irrelevant. So I'm just going to share with you some thoughts. And I think some of you know me as in my previous capacity as UN Rapporteur on Violence Against Women. And having held that position for 6 years has really educated me incredibly into where we are, where we need to go, what is working, what is not working. And the discussion of the previous panel on the issue of culture, religion, is a very central issue. And I think UN Women must come to terms with the debates in this area, not that we have as academics or practitioners, but this is truly an area where major tensions are created. When I was the rapporteur, I did about 17 country visits, and in each country I went to, I would hear a similar discussion. Well, 2 of the countries that I visited were Western European countries. There, the argument was, you know, we are a rational, legal society. Our women have completed their emancipation, but we have these immigrants from very primitive cultures which we need to work on. But in the majority of other countries that I went to, which were can be considered as countries of the South in different, from different traditions and cultures and religions, I would hear the constant argument that, oh, in our culture this is not possible. One of the last countries I visited was Moldova, and we were having an interesting debate with the chief prosecutor. And I was accompanied by, we had a joint mission with the torture rapporteur. The prosecutor said, oh, the Moldovan culture, he went on, and I said, Mr. Prosecutor, with all due respect, I have heard this over and over again. This sounds more like patriarchal culture to me than Moldovan culture. Don't be so unjust to your own culture. He laughed and he resigned to the fact. I think there is this universality in this kind of a cultural discourse because of the universality of hegemony of a very masculine patriarchal culture which predominates the entire world and manifests in different forms and different shapes. So what has become the famous phrase of clash of civilizations is in fact clash of masculinities, I argue. And women are not passive standbyers, of course, in all this, but rarely do we find in the clash of such civilizations or masculinities any space for women's voices to be heard. In that sense, I think the previous panel, very eloquently, the speakers showed that women are they have religions, they have cultures, but they basically want to live free and equal life with dignity. But unfortunately, acknowledging this does not do away with the problem of power politics. Religion and culture has become a major discourse which manipulates lives, and women are often put in a position of, particularly women of the South, to choose between their rights or their culture. And I think this is a very unfair choice to be made, because women have other alternative ways of existing. And it is this voice that needs to be heard, and it is this voice that we need to be able to integrate into our own theoretical and paradigmatic frameworks, which I don't think we have done so sufficiently yet. But what I want to really point to is this, of course, I don't want to repeat the previous panel, but I think for women, UN women to go forward, there are basically 2 things that I can, drawing on my rapporteur work, that I can point to as issues that need to be of high priority. One, violence against women, which has been a very powerful entry point. I come from a development background, and the woman in development discourse was very powerful in terms of mobilizing women from all around the world, particularly third world women's issues became more visible within that context. But I think violence against women had a far more deeper penetration into everyday life than any other agenda so far, because violence against women questioned intimate lives. It penetrated into the private lives. Therefore, it questioned and raised issues regarding taken for granted realities of life. In that sense, it was very powerful. It questioned the whole notion of doctrine of state responsibility, that state is not only responsible not to do harm, but state is responsible to take positive action to prevent others, non-state actors, from doing harm. So the private sphere has really opened up to scrutiny. It has also transformed very much what we understand of human rights itself. However, with all this very powerful transformative impact, violence against women is still very much treated as an isolated, selective issue, as if it is totally different from the general status of women and women's subordination in general. Even the setup of the United Nations institutionally reflects this very well. The CSW is located in New York, which deals with policy issues regarding women's empowerment and advancement, and violence against women is in Geneva, and it deals with human rights issues, the harm done. And when I was the rapporteur, of course, I worked in DAW as well for 2.5 years during Beijing +5, and I wasn't quite aware of this fragmentation. When I became the rapporteur and I started working in Geneva, I said, there's something intimately wrong here. The rapporteur on violence against women was not even mandated to report to CSW. So there's such an incredible fragmentation in the way we work within the UN. And I think those of us outside of the UN fall into similar patterns, unfortunately. And only in 2009, after significant advocacy, I was able to get a mandate for the Special Rapporteur to report to the CSW. So I think UN Women has to take into consideration how it can, on the one hand, allow, of course, decentralization of activities within the UN, but at the same time, conceptually, how it can integrate so that these different spheres of activities, so that we're not working in isolation, because violence against women is intimately linked to women's empowerment, women's subordination, etc. Similar to this, the second issue that I would very much like to bring to the attention of Dr. Bachelet and her team is the issue of the UN human rights discourse itself, which is very much fragmented. The twin covenants, which came out of the Human Rights Declaration, which is a more holistic perspective on human rights, has codified human rights law into civil and political and social and economic. And this polarization, of course, depending upon the context in which it is defined, has given hierarchy or primacy to civil and political rights. And economic rights became aspirational. It is very difficult for me to understand how one can achieve their political and civil rights, which is obligatory by human rights law, how this can be realized if economic and social rights are merely aspirational. I think both types of rights, both waves of rights, require positive action on the part of states to realize in any given country. And it is interesting that states rarely react to states' inability to comply with their social and economic obligations in the same way they do with political and civil rights. When political and civil rights are violated in a given country, the world goes up in arms. Of course, even there, very selectively, no doubt. But nonetheless, these are the real rights in terms of the human rights system. But the breach of economic and social rights rarely raises any question. And this is something we need to question ourselves and argue that the two rights are integrally related, and particularly from the point of view of women's empowerment and women's civil and political rights, unless they have the economic independence, unless they have access to property, their ability to, or their capability to respond to violations of their rights, to violence, is completely undermined. So these are two areas, I think, that need to be emphasized and taken into consideration so that UN Women can develop a vision which is based on a holistic understanding of women's empowerment and gender equality. So here, in terms of achieving gender inequality, one, I would like to strongly argue that gender equality is not about equal opportunities, which is a concept which is basis of most state policies. EU directives are totally about equal opportunities. It is important to have equal opportunities, but gender inequality is about structured inequalities, which is linked to the issues that I have just talked about. So we cannot give equal opportunity to those who are structurally unequal. I mean, a debate that was very much central to the civil rights movement and so forth. But I think we forget these. We need to renew them over and over again. The second issue that I would also emphasize, and I think Madame Bachelet's talk touched upon this as three questions that she posed to the audience: gender mainstreaming. Now, this sounds so nice to the ear, and we're all mainstreaming. I often wonder, what are we mainstreaming? Do you know what you're mainstreaming? We are male streaming most often. And I have to argue that this is a concept that needs to be revisited. We need to clearly articulate what we mean by gender mainstreaming, because I have seen in countries of the North as well as in the South that gender mainstream has led to the whole issue of women's advancement to go astray. In developed countries, and I have visited Sweden and the Netherlands, in Netherlands in particular, I was told, we are mainstreaming now. We don't need to, please wrap up. We don't need to talk about women's equality. We are mainstreaming. So what they do when they say mainstreaming is that fragment the issues, and each issue is taken care of by a different state entity. And of course, in many of the developing countries, gender mainstreaming is a perfect cover-up for those who are skeptical about the whole issue of women's advancement to begin with. So we've gone a long way, but we have to keep on pushing. Thank you.
Good afternoon. As we approach the end of the meeting, it becomes really very difficult to add something news actually to the wonderful speeches that have been made. First of all, thank you very much, Mahnaz, for organizing of this day, and thank you very much also for inviting me. So I was thinking, what could I add actually to everything what is said till now? And I have made 4 observations, and that's actually today. On the basis of today, I made 4 observations. But of course, what I am going to say is because of everything what I have experienced and what I have done and what I do. So, as you know, Oxfam Novib is an organization which I would say sells change. That's actually our product, if you want, in the market terminology, because that's modern, so let me use it. But what is this? What is the question that we actually ask ourselves and wonder day by day? The important question is how change happens. And I think this is also listening to today's discussions and debates, the heart of the debate. So the first thing, and that's my first observation also today, is of course, what is your vision towards what should the change happen? What do you want? What is actually your aim? And we have had wonderful discussions around universality and human rights. For us, is that also the point of departure? That's where we don't compromise on it. Human rights, rights-based approach, to actually towards everything what we do in the whole development issues that we deal with it. The last, I take this position as executive director of Oxfam Novib 3 years ago. And since then, I have had several discussions, and who is familiar for you, if you are familiar with the discussions and debate in the Netherlands, maybe it is not surprising. A lot of discussions about what are we doing in Muslim majority countries, in Arab countries, supporting human rights organizations, supporting women rights organizations. They are marginalized, they don't have any influence. Actually, there are Islamic organizations, they define the discourse, they are the main actors of change and what is happening. And I kept answering no. Our actually point of departure is human rights. That remains, and we think if you want to achieve actually the vision that you have, then you have to support those organizations. You can't bring the change from outside. Change has to happen from inside, but you can be, as an organization like Oxfam Novib, a kind of catalysator for those groups and those organizations. And it is wonderful to see in a country like Egypt, where we have been supporting many of these organizations, that those organizations were very, very key in everything what happened in January and February in Egypt. And that showed that we shouldn't give up on what we believe in it, and we shouldn't think that human rights notion or the notion of rights, this is something exclusive to Western societies, or something should be, adjust to other cultures or societies. So that's the first observation. The second one, revolutions. So, and that's maybe again something coming from not only what we do, not on the basis of my experiences from the work of Oxfam Novib, but also as someone who has been part of Iranian revolution. I was 18, 19, during the revolution 1979 in Iran. So I would say, I don't know where Karima is sitting, but I was one of, if you look at this kind of images and pictures, one of the youngsters and, shouting and asking for freedom and social justice. That movement was also mainly not organized, that's not true, but mainly moved by youth of Iran at that time. And it's always inspiring. It's always inspiring to see when actually the mass movement is created and the people are on the streets. That's really very nice, because it actually triggers our imagination. We imagine that we are maybe there, and we imagine our own society that we want, and think that's also the same what they want. And that's at this moment, I would say, in Tunisia and in Egypt and other places, actually the very, very crucial moment to try to remain in contact, stay in contact, and support really the progressive groups and women rights organizations and human rights organizations, so that the change, that momentum, that actually also is directed towards a society that really rights-based is. Otherwise, I mean, just the moment itself is not enough. Just appraising is not enough. It is actually now very crucial to see where those societies are heading to. So that means we should actually, in our inspiration, maybe especially because we are from outside at this moment, be or show more wisdom, if you want. Because the moment can actually take us and not think about what is going to happen the next. So, and why I'm saying that is because I think listening to what was said about that maybe in the whole discussion, nobody, that was said, that's about Egyptian, that's not about women's rights. That's exactly the discussion and debate that we had at that time in Iran. That's now about the revolution, it's about all of us, and we don't talk about the women's rights. And I would say that's exactly what we should be really very, very cautious about it and very vocal about it. No, that's the moment that we need also to tackle women's rights. The third one, and I have 2 minutes, so 1 minute for the next 2 points. The high expectations towards UN women. Again, we published a survey showing what in a survey with about 100 NGOs from 75 countries, and the question was, what do you think that the priorities of UN women should be? And it shouldn't be a surprise to you, violence against women, that was the most important theme, but also rural women, they should be actually the target of the work of women, UN women, and also the way of working, not being a close United Nations organization which is not approachable, which is not accessible, but really it should be accessible, it should be open, it should actually be in cooperation with the civil society organizations. And the expectations are very high. And my point is that's correct. I mean, that's why we actually wanted this body, why we struggled for it, that this body comes. But at the same time, actually this body is not going to bring the change. We are going to bring the change. We have to be the change agents. And that means that we have to hold UN women accountable, that UN women actually changes also the other UN agencies, and the programming that they have, that it actually brings the learning points so that they can take it and show also to the governments and to the other bodies, so that they can realize the gender justice. My last point, and that's actually the explicit question of Mahnaz, that I say something about that, and that's maybe because we are also a funding agency. And that's about the resources available for this work. What we see happening is that more and more governments, at least the European governments, for example, Dutch government, which was very generous for a long time, having a very progressive position, and making really resources available for this kind of work, they are cutting. And also an organization like ours is facing enormous cuts. for this year, I have, unfortunately, I have the responsibility of cutting 60 million euros. And that's enormous, 60 million euros. I mean, that's really enormous amount of money. And that affects our work. I mean, the money never has been spent. Actually, a really very, very small part of it was spent to the organization and organizational costs. And the most of money goes to the financing of programs and our partners. And we have to cut that, and we have to stop actually parts of our work, which is very, very important. And it is painful. It's really painful. And then is the issue how we are going to deal with that. What is our strategy about that? How are we going to have actually mobilize other sources? Because the work is still needed to be done, so we need the resources, but how we are going to do it, and I hope that we have the possibility of answering some of those questions during the debate. Thank you very much.
Manaz.
So where do we go from here? Actually, to go back to the morning and to the statement of Dr. Bachelet, I think so far as the thematics are concerned that she described, there is really very little that we can add in any significant way to what she put forward as the themes selected for UN Women. But what we've been talking about, and I think what would be very helpful to look to and analyze, is how UN Women situates itself within the UN system. And we keep talking about the responsibility of UN Women to civil society, the way we want to affect UN Women, and how we relate to this entity. And we say very proudly and happily, UN Women is us, and then we think a little and say, no, it is not, because after all, it's a UN organization, and the UN is a collection of governments who don't particularly take notice of us very much. So what is it? Is it us, or is it them, or is it the other? And I think to figure this relationship, if we can have some notion of that, it will be very helpful as one of the things that we have done today. It seems as if whenever we talk about mutual responsibility and somehow answerability of an entity to a group, there has to be some sort of mutual give and take. So how do we manage that so that we both benefit, both activists and feminists, and also the UN entity? We know that UN agencies usually do not answer very much as a regular basis to civil society. I mean, I don't think WHO goes around asking civil society, what do you think of me? Or what are your ideas about what I should do? Or any of the others. So if we want this one, which we've worked so hard to advocate for, to create, and we expect so much of, if we want it to be responsible to us and answerable to us, I think we also need to own it somewhat. And in order to own it, I think we should somehow give it something and then get something. We need to empower it so that then it can empower us. So how do we do that? We have mentioned some things during the day, and I think one of the most important things remains what we've heard from the field, and that is raising consciousness, not only of the importance of UN Women, but also of the importance of also of the UN itself. You'll be surprised, not in the places where they have culture, but the places where they don't have culture, like the United States, how little they know about such a thing as CEDAW. I speak at universities often. University students, graduate students, have never heard of CEDAW. You won't believe this, but that's the truth. We live in a cocoon of our own where we think that how could they not, you know? And so we need to not only make this entity known, but just have the people understand what the United Nations is all about and how it could serve us, especially since in the last few years, the United States, especially for 8 years, did so much to harm the United Nations and to belittle it and to cut its budget and to limit its authority. And some in the United States still see the United Nations as the enemy. Some governmental entities and some policymakers see it in that way. So one part of this mutual relationship is raising consciousness at the popular level of the importance of this entity, because we know also that governments more and more these days, when we see the Middle East exploding, we can imagine if Libya is exploding, you can imagine that almost everywhere there has to be answerability of some sort, responsiveness of some sort, and especially with the technology that we have at our disposal these days. So governments are affected by what people think. And if the people think that the UN and the UN women is important, then it's more likely that they would contribute to it, that they would give it some priority, that they would provide some resources. So the consciousness raising at the popular level, which is our work, we do that in our daily life, is important if it focuses not just on particular resolutions, which are important, 1325, CEDAW itself, and etc., but also on the UN process and how the mutual pressure between UN and national organizations can, in effect, push governments in a certain direction. So that's one way that we can have some influence on the future of UN women. And the other is another thing that we talked about and has been mentioned, and Farah just addressed it in terms of the financial crisis and the effect it has on funding on all institutions, especially a new institution, and especially a new institution that has to do with women. So what we need to do is apply the non-traditional ways of fundraising. And also this has something to do with commitment as well. If you owe some of your resources to the masses of women and men across the world, you have a different position in terms of strength than if you owe a lot of your money to the Saudi government, you see. So I think it makes a difference if we can try, especially with the young people, especially with young women who seem to be so ready to be energized. If they haven't been joining the movement in the numbers that we wish, possibly it's because we haven't inspired, or there hasn't been enough inspiration, because we see, even in places when they have been so restricted, when it comes to aspirations and hopes and possibilities, they do come and join and mobilize and do what they have to do. So partly we can do fundraising in non-traditional ways, and we can ask individuals to commit themselves, individuals who work for us, even on a small level, so that there is that mutual connection. So situating of UN Women in terms of what we can give it, and also what it can give us. Again, I think it was very rightly pointed out a number of times that there is a difference between us and UN entity. There are so many things that the UN entity can do, and so many things that it simply cannot do. What it can do is to provide safe spaces for civil society to address the powerful and those who make decisions and make laws and allocate resources. Convening power. Hearing us itself, but more importantly, allowing us to be heard by others. So the convening power of UN Women on behalf of civil society can be a very important service, and also making sure that other agencies, and I think Dr. Bachelet herself mentioned that, but I think possibly with even more emphasis than she expressed today, and I'm sure that it's in her mind, to make the other UN entities not just work better, but be feminist in their outlook, to look at health issues, at reproductive rights issues, at labor issues from the point of view of women. And how they have been affected by this lack of equality. So I think this, the relationship between us and this new entity is something that needs for us to think more about and to form and to give shape to. The other area that I think that, has been talked about a lot here is and that's why we had a whole panel given to religion and culture and secularism and women's rights. And because UN Women is going to be a global entity dealing with all sorts of varieties of behavior patterns, contexts, and so forth, it's important to clarify, and these brilliant speakers earlier and in this panel have all talked about this. And I think we have come to some sort of an understanding in our discussions so far on the idea that what ails us, in effect, is patriarchy, the culture of patriarchy. Patriarchy in some of our minds comes out to mean these mean men, some of whom are with us, the nicer kind. But, but patriarchy is not about men. Patriarchy is about a structure of interaction between people. And it's good for us to remind ourselves that throughout the ages, throughout history, throughout the globe, almost everywhere, the relationship between human beings, female and male human beings, has been almost identical within the family, within the community, in the workplace, in the school. There's always been a vertical relationship, top-down, the father, the teacher, the employer, whatever. And that hierarchical system, which is the essence of patriarchy, and they have duplicated it in religions, in governments, in literature, in the arts, everything has duplicated that structure. That is something that has brought us into this mess that we're in right now. So we need to change this culture. And this culture is capable of changing. As a matter of fact, countries that have not had a culture have in fact changed what they had before they have reached democracy or some semblance of human rights. Remember that we actually started in the United States with all men are created equal. And then we went to the French Revolution with liberty, fraternity, equality, fraternity, no sisterhood, brotherhood. And then it took a long while before women, it was some 100 or some years, and then it was Susan B. Anthony who said to men, their rights and nothing more, to women, their rights and nothing less. 100 years at least, and it took a long time, and we still are not even there. So culture change has to happen because there was a time when you could say that we're building a new democracy, a people's government, by simply saying all men are created equal and meaning it, because women didn't have the right to vote or participate. So this culture change has happened all around the world whenever individual rights and democratic interaction has had to be created or constituted. And today in the Middle East, we have the same situation. That is, we have groups of people, largely men, we have to admit it, we love to think that there are more women out there, but there are not nearly as many as the men, and they are shouting for democracy. And every survey that we have seen has shown that people in that part of the world, like people everywhere, even more than people elsewhere, love and admire democracy. Whatever statistics you get, they come up 90%, 97% in favor of democracy. But when you come to gay rights, women's rights, to anything having to do with the acceptance of religious difference, then they plunge to 25%, 30%. So when we're talking about these countries transitioning, we have to talk about culture change. It's not enough to overthrow Gaddafi or Mubarak or X or Y. It's important to learn ourselves and be able to integrate in our own way of interacting with each other the concepts of tolerance, of respect, of inclusiveness, of listening respectfully to the other. And that is what we need to bring to the table as women. So I think that we have a whole lot of experience, shared experience among us in how to do that, how to bring about the kind of transformative, participatory interaction between people, leadership, if you will, that will guarantee democratic interaction. And that has to be something that, again, is not dictated to people or preached to people, but it comes about by providing space for people to experience it, to do it together. I remember a friend of mine from an African country, which I won't name, was talking about democracy. She was saying the difference between the guys in the West and the guys in our country is that in the West, when they lose the election, they leave. In our country, when they lose the election, they do not leave. You see? So to internalize this idea that whether it's an argument or if it's a project or if it's a government, if we lose the argument, we have to leave and try again and try better and negotiate until we can win. So I'm taking more than my share because I'm also supposed to wrap up. So I'm saying all that's in my heart all at once in one sitting, and then we'll go on to Q&A if you don't mind. So the interaction in positioning of UN Women is one area where we are supposed to continue these discussions, as was suggested. And the other is of the foundational look at the architecture of human relationships, which is the essence of patriarchy, to have a position on that which is clear and which is basic and which is strongly supported by inclusiveness and understanding that all human beings are created equal and have rights by virtue of their individual humanity. That is something that I promise you, many of us who travel a lot around the world, talk to the grassroots women, you look at that wonderful Declaration of Human Rights, you go down all of those articles, there's not one article that one woman would say, I don't want this right, because you see, I happen to be Chinese, or I don't want this right because I'm from Zimbabwe. Everybody has that aspiration. Nobody has achieved it. The only thing is, they say, don't go to war on our behalf, or waving the Declaration of Human Rights and then doing some other thing. Don't push us around in the name of human rights. Don't play politics with human rights. And allow us to shape the ways we want to implement human rights. And that's, again, something that we have learned in our actual work, all of us, that you have universal rights, but you have contextual implementation and presentation, which is very respectful of diversity. And we have to understand that without that, there is no diversity. There is no possibility of respecting difference. So in that sense, then, we, I think, have begun a very interesting and good conversation on these two general thematics. And we have a really open road ahead of us. And I look forward to reactions from the rest.
Before Manaz sits down, I'd like us all to acknowledge how much work she's done to bring us here together today. It's quite extraordinary.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
You can line up as before. Yes.
Hi, so...
We're going to hear from the internet first.
Is that okay? Can you hear me? Oh, no.
Is it on? Okay.
So from our viewers on the web, we have a question that would probably go to Farah Karimi, but there are implications that I'm sure everybody would like to perhaps comment on. How can we deal with the agenda of gender inequality with the current right-wing Dutch government and claim our space? Now we have to go to the next part of the message. And claim our space for human rights in the Netherlands. Thank you.
Let's get a few from each side before we...
Hello, my name is Linda McDonald. I'm from Canada, and I'm a human rights defender of women who've experienced non-state torture in the private sphere. And my question is for Yakin Ertak. Yakin, I know your work with the violence against women was excellent, and also now with the Committee on the Prevention of Torture in Europe. What I'm asking is, how can we engage UN women to make a space at the table for women who've endured non-state actor torture? And I can give some examples of how they're not really at the table now. I was at CEDAW in 2009 in a Canadian delegation, and actually the CEDAW experts were quite resistive to hearing about non-state torture, and I was shocked about that. And also we know that the Committee Against Torture is mainly looking at state torture, although Manfred Nowak wrote excellent reports opening the definition of torture to powerlessness. And I'd like to hear your ideas of how we can engage that process to a wider audience. Thank you.
We'll take one more here, and then we'll get some answers, and then we'll go on this side.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Sarah Criction, and I'm with the Global...
You have to talk louder.
A little closer. Is that better? Great. My name is Sarah Criction, and I'm with the Global Fund for Women. And just 2 points. First, I want to thank the panelists for ending violence against women and adequate resources for that. And secondly, I wanted to highlight a secondary role that UN Women plays that some people do not know, and it is that it manages 2 multilateral funding mechanisms. So similar to UNDP, which manages, I think, over 30 of these. And this is a mechanism that funds many NGOs in this room and beyond. And so it plays the role not only as an agency, but as an entity that can influence funding as well. And one of those entities, I believe, is the UN Trust Fund to End Violence Against Women. And when we look at the data for ending violence against women, it's on par with HIV/AIDS. It is a global health pandemic. Yet, if you look at the fund to fight HIV/AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis, governments provide about $3 billion each year in funding. And for the UN Trust Fund to End Violence Against Women, I think it's somewhere around 20 million, so less than 0.5 of 1%. So my question to the panelists, I think, is how do we, when we advocate not just for adequate funding for UN Women as an entity, so that $500 million first-year goal that Dr. Bachelet has laid out, how do we also advocate for funding for those multilateral funding mechanisms that will fund the movement and many of the people in this room as well? Thank you.
The panel, people like to respond to these first 3?
Yeah, well, maybe I'll start. Non-state actors and defining abuses experienced by women as torture. Of course, here I must refer to our dear friend Rhonda Copeland. Many of you probably know her. Way back in the 70s, she wrote about and defined violence against women as a form of torture. And that has helped a great deal to open up the debate in this area. And Novak's report, of course, was a very good one coming out from the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture to acknowledge this link. However, how can we make the UN more responsive? It's a very difficult question because the issue of torture, there are, yes, women experience torture, but I have always made this distinction. Torture in the classical sense or in the conventional definition is understood to be inflicted by state actors to people who are, and this is generally male experience, of course, but women may also be undergoing the similar situation, in places where their liberties are deprived. So it's a very technical definition. But beyond the technical definition, there's also this factor which we need to keep in mind, that in responding to torture, you have rehabilitation programs, etc., etc. You know, the person who is tortured undergoes rehabilitation and is healed, and there's a great deal of politics around it where there's support for the person who has been tortured. Violence against women, while resembles and is a form of torture, is not only about the harm done. It's about the whole subordination of women. And that is why it is rarely acknowledged. And these are two areas which make responding to violence against women politically, socially, culturally very difficult. I mean, everybody's talking about violence against women today, but they're talking about it in a very restrictive manner. We have not yet been able to link it to all these underlying factors because it is so difficult. Governments pass laws, they open shelters, and that's it. They think they are dealing with torture and violence against women. But even this much, it's very difficult for states to engage in because it requires a commitment beyond the harm done. And it requires an incredible amount of channeling of funds. So it's a politically and culturally charged issue. But the issue of non-state actor violence is becoming more and more discussed in the mainstream UN circles. There are very powerful books now. I believe Andrew right, thank you very much, has written on non-state actors' responsibility. I think we need to keep pushing that debate. So we're not there yet quite. With respect to the trust fund, we have the head of the trust fund, UNIFEM Trust Fund here, I think, Mariam. You can discuss the issue with her more in detail. But I believe there are two things that I'd like to say here. One, the women's issues or gender equality issues has moved from the periphery to the mainstream. And I think the launching we had was spectacular. Ted Turner was there, everybody was there, the Secretary General was there. But I still feel it's quite rhetorically done. I would have expected Ted Turner to make a big commitment with dollars, you know. He didn't. However, the Secretary General said, and I will also find money for you guys. I think we should hold him to that. Accountability is not only for states, but also for the United Nations. And things like the trust fund, when I was a rapporteur, I was trying to get the violence against women mandate to be linked to the UNIFEM Trust Fund, and I also negotiated this with UNIFEM to a degree. I don't know if the new rapporteur is pursuing it, but to link these different mechanisms so that we don't work in isolation. But these are still ideas I think we need to continue to pursue. I'll stop there.
Well, I'll just pick up on that last question because actually I didn't say very much because we're at the end of the day, but I think it is important about the structures. I actually do think it's important for people to understand that the bringing together of the 4 existing units about women in the UN was actually an enormously big structural decision on the part of the UN. This is a 21st century structure. The UN has never fully done before the bringing together of its so-called normative and policy side with its operational and field presence. And the reason I'm saying that is that I think some of the problems that Yakin is talking about were part of the very impetus to create this structure, to say that field work and policy must be linked, that the operations of the work on women's rights in the women's specific areas represented by these agencies must be better linked to the gender integration work of women in the human rights system in Geneva, in UNICEF, and other agencies. And I'm not sure that we haven't spent a lot of time on that, but it's actually quite important in making our strategies to realize that we have the opportunity now to really talk about a more integrated system and what we expect from that. And one of the things that I think women don't realize in that is that the two things I want to say. One is that there are the funds, and I thank you for the question because I don't think it comes up very much in the current presentation of UN Women. It does include the two funds, the Gender Equity Fund and the Trust Fund on Violence Against Women. What that means is there is still a very strong mandate for this UN Women agency to include the funding of specific activities, both NGO activity and governmental activity. So when we talk about how we want to influence UN Women, I think we need to talk about both sides of that. What do we think needs to be funded? What do we think are the critical areas of work today for both governments and NGOs? And also to start demanding from all these actors who are saying women are key, that they put their money where their mouth is. I mean, if I hear one more time when all of the, financial institutions and the development agencies say, women are the key to this, that, and the other, everything in the globe, and then you look at the percentage of the budget. I mean, I think on every level, private sector, as well as governmental and public sector, UN Women now, because it's one, and so you really can focus on that specific, which can have designated pieces, but we really want to talk about the whole and the need for a holistic agenda here. I could say more, but I'll stop there.
I think I respond to very shortly to the question related with the Netherlands. I think what is really worrying about the developments in the Netherlands is that actually this shift to more conservatism happened with rhetoric against Islam and migrants. And what we are now witnessing is that actually the political party or political movement, this right-wing political movement, which is very actually constituted around against Islam, that now is allying with the Orthodox Christian party that we have and taking a position against abortion. So you see, which started actually with a position. It was against Islam and against actually migrants, because in Islam women have a very bad position, now ends up with a situation in which actually the rights of the indigenous Dutch women is also not more respected. And I think that's really what is happening now in the Netherlands. And we have really, again, to struggle for the rights, and that's not only in the Netherlands, you see it in more places, struggle for the rights that we take it for a long time as granted.
Actually, I would like to take what Farah said about the position of the Dutch conservatives with regards to Islam. I just wanted to say this in this particular group here, that what is happening in terms of Islamophobia is really a huge human rights issue in this country and in some of the Western countries. That is, anymore among enlightened peoples, there's hardly any race, any difference, any gender issue even. I think even when you get to animal rights, I think there is some care of not using certain language or not stereotyping so much. When it comes to Muslims, there is no holds barred. You can say anything, you can call people anything, and people don't even realize what they're doing. I know there was, for instance, this uprising about an NPR anchor who said, "I'm afraid when I look back and I see somebody in Muslim garb, And there were a whole, for one thing, what is Muslim garb? Is she wearing Muslim garb? Am I wearing it? Is Yakin wearing it? Or what is Muslim garb? I mean, 1.5 billion people around the world, they wear all kinds of stuff. Some of them have their midriffs, like in India. Or they don't wear anything, or whatever. So what is Muslim garb? And then people who, in the name of freedom of expression, started, of course, Fox News, as the main chief defenders of freedom of expression, came out saying that, oh, this guy had a right to say what he was saying. Well, you don't have a right to say that. You know, why would you be, that prejudicial to identify people in that way? So this is something that is not only deteriorating rights of Muslim citizens of these countries, but also generally, because once you start allowing yourself to denigrate a group of people without distinction, there's no end to it. So I'm sorry, this was just from the heart. I just wanted to say that it's an important human rights issue. But also, just a quick comment on non-state actors. I think that non-state actors, a whole bunch of them, are very bad guys, and we all are non-state actors. No, I'm talking about the baddies.
We've only, yeah.
I'm talking about the baddies, and the fundamentalists, the radical religious people, and the ultra-conservatives, those guys. And what's happening, unfortunately, is that there is more and more power to those people. And these changes that we are seeing in large parts of the world, and especially in the MENA region, are going to end up with a lot of these non-state actors becoming state actors, which gives them a whole lot of money and a whole lot of power. Unfortunately, there is that possibility. But even if they stay non-state actors, we really need to figure that out. I don't think anybody has quite figured out, because our human rights work has always been naming and shaming related to governments, and we really don't know how to relate to non-state actors of that sort. So it should be one of the items on human rights agendas. How do we actually react? How do we deal? How do we hold responsible?
Now, we've only got 5 minutes left, and we've got 4 questioners. So my question to these 4 is, will you be disciplined and talk for 45 seconds each so we can hear you all, or shall I cross it off before? Yes? Are you on your honor?
Of course.
Okay. 45 seconds each.
There's no way. No, I do one time, because I lived in Pakistan. A lot of what you're saying, I live out. I mean, we have to live in those situations. I want to connect it to human rights and culture and funding. The thing is that a lot of the funding that comes in, one, the funding itself has an agenda. So the funding UN Women will get has an agenda. The funding that Novib gives has an agenda. For the first time, I was in a place that, it was actually, I think, Oxford, Novib, where they did the tilawat, the prayer in the beginning. And I said, we've never done that in 30 years. But they're saying even the Dutch come and do it, and therefore it's become a norm. In other words, you get into the culture of it, and therefore it's sort of reversing, it's reinforcing and bringing it on us because somebody wants to be politically correct. But the bigger issue was UNIFEM. They gave out a call for a proposal in which they said they would support alternative forms of justice, the jirga, etc. Yes. Because a lot of these, the Dutch, the British, the Americans, because they want to make up with the Taliban, they go into the jirga thing. So we raised the question that it was illegal in Pakistan, which it is, and that there was a high court decision, and therefore we said we could take you to court. But we couldn't take the UNIFEM to court, but we could take the government of Pakistan to court, because they were breaking the law. But UNIFEM insisted, because Norway and Holland and British, etc., insisted. So we now have UN Women that will be supporting informal systems of justice. And I think this is a very tricky point in terms of funding from capitalism, from IMF, from the World Bank. The other thing with IMF is UN Women going to pay back the money, or are we? If UN Women is paying it back, fine, they can go to the IMF. If they are putting us in hawk, which our own governments have done, and generations are going to pay off this World Bank loan, etc., on their agenda, I think we really need to worry about who is going to be paying. Thank you.
Thank you.
Kenita Placid, Ilga World, and United and Strong Sinusha. The question is really, we talk about the whole human rights issues, and we talk about women's rights being human rights. In my context, we also speak about gay and lesbian rights also being human rights. And we always find that when we speak about human rights, there's always an inner circle and outer circle conversation, and what we are able to speak about in certain circles and what is being eliminated. Whenever so often, sexual orientation and gender identity always seems to be an outside a circle conversation because context is not being brought in. My question is UN Women going to be doing the same thing? Is gay and lesbian rights going to be an outside circle conversation, or is it going to be inclusive? It's also a conversation that I know UN Women operate in many regions. However, I felt it is very much being underrepresented, not seeing any persons from Caribbean being speakers out here. Question also... You're sitting up there representing me? I didn't hear the St. Lucia part. I heard Nigeria, not St. Lucia. Second question, a third question will also go to with women learning partnership. How inclusive is it? Is it open to the Caribbean? What can we take full advantage of, the programs and so on? So just send out some information as to how we can be more inclusive in the Women Learning Partnership as well as UN Women. Thank you.
Thank you. Kia ora, hello, I'm Jill Greer, the Director General of IPPF. I have the privilege to represent 153 autonomous organisations which must have 50% women on their board, 20% young people. At the moment, our work is very much governed by Beijing, by Cairo and the MDGs. The MDGs are the development framework which has, in my view, a very weak goal and indicator for women, nothing really for young people at all. And if we look at the way forward, we have 5 years in front of us. A review of the MDGs in 2013, an extension of Cairo in 2014. I haven't heard anyone talk about Beijing. And then a new development framework. Last year at the MDG Summit, 24 NGOs, or at least members of civil society, including us, luckily, were allowed to speak for 3 minutes, then reduced to 1 minute, at the round tables at the summit. 25 other members of civil society were allowed into the UN every day. And this week, many of you have queued up, I think, in long lines. My question is, how can we and UN Women make sure there is real space for civil society at the country level, at the regional level, but most of all, at the UN level, when these decisions that will frame the development framework for the next 5 years or more are made? And I remind us all, whatever side we come from, that reproductive health was not included in the MDGs until after 7 years of oblivion and disregard. Thank you.
I'm Dutch. I share Farah's concerns, and I'd say we have an election on Tuesday. Oh. Vote for a progressive party.
Bravo. Bravo.
Panel, how about it's 5, a very brief au revoir.
Well, I think that's very well put. Well, all the points that have been raised are very pertinent. I'll just say that human rights is a sphere for contestation, and those of you, whether gay or other concerns, if you're not reflected in the human rights discourse at the moment, keep on the fight. Thank you.
Charlotte?
Well, just to add on that same broad point, reproductive health is in the MDGs after 7 years because the women's movement and reproductive rights and health movement fought for it. And that's the only way it happens. I mean, there's no question. I've been part of trying to get lesbian rights on the human rights agenda since 1975 in Mexico City. We've had 3 or 4 breakthroughs and moments where there was at least some reference to sexual orientation. The most advanced has been at the Human Rights Council in Geneva because of the success of framing this as human rights, but it's not over. So absolutely, UN Women will do probably as much as we're able to organize support for them to do. So absolutely, keep on keeping on. I did want to say one comment about Nikat's point about the money, and I think Malika said it in the morning, just to remember that, of course, funding has an agenda, and I think that that is one of the things that we also have to be struggling around, and I'm sure that Farah will speak to it more.
No, exactly. Actually, funding has an agenda. I said also we see ourselves as a rights-based organization, an organization who wants actually drive the human rights agenda, and that's all about it. But we are not the only player in the whole scene, and unfortunately, there are more and more other actors coming in, and they don't have always the same agenda as we have. And we didn't talk about now. For example, new emerging powers like China in Africa, or, for example, Arab foundations from Emirates, where I had once a conversation, and they said, so we would like to cooperate with you, and we want to actually fund some of your programs, but then only organizations that there are no women represented in the boards. So now we say thank you very much. So, but that's actually, and there is a huge money involved in it. Huge money is involved in it. So I think we have really to understand that the whole funding environment is changing enormously. Rapidly, the private foundations, the emerging powers, and everybody has indeed own agenda. And I think if we want to really stick to the human rights agenda, we have to start also dialogue with them so that you can influence maybe their agenda.
Manaz, last word.
Okay.
Well, I'll only mention WLP, the question about WLP. We work on curriculum development, manuals in 20 languages, all on the website. We work on training, workshops in whichever organization, wherever, would like to organize one on participatory leadership, on ICTs for social networking. And we do advocacy campaigns for CEDAW, for nationality rights, and so forth. So please pay attention to the website and get in touch, and we'd love to work with you.
That's a great ending. First, we'd like to thank the panel, and then I'd like to thank Manaz for bringing us together. This is an amazing historical moment for us to be together.
If you allow me, I want to thank all of you, many of you who have come such a long way and have been so patient all day and haven't had a chance to speak, but you have listened so carefully and sent such good vibes. I also want to thank the speakers, wonderful speakers, and also Dr. Bachelet, who started the day on the right foot, and Soraya, who went through a lot of trouble to tape her statement for us. I'd like very much to thank the Center for Public Scholarship and Gender Studies at New School, and Anne particularly, and Ariane Mack, who've been such good hosts, and of course Roberta Sutton. I don't know where Roberta is. Roberta is just a jewel and has always been so supportive of these gatherings. And of course the wonderful WLP staff, all of them, but most especially Tyler Lopez. Is anybody here? Abdul Khan, who's been doing the webcast, Catherine Harrington, and of course Jennifer Pendleton, our new acting executive director, and the wonderful partners who are here. Thank you so much. It's been a joy being with you and working with you today. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.